Yo guys, what is up? Welcome back to another video. Today we're looking at the legal side of things with regards to cannabis arrests specifically. Unfortunately, more often than you would think, people in South Africa are still being arrested for cannabis, probably on the daily. So what we've done is invited Stefan Bezuidenhout from SJF Attorneys to share a little bit of information on what to do if you get arrested, the process of going through an arrest and what to do sort of after it, and a little bit of prevention. It is not a fun situation to be in. It's important and critical, if that, to know your rights throughout the process. A video like this could really save you a lot of time, pain, probably money and legal fees just by knowing these few basic things. We spend a lot of time at Maron SA putting together these videos for you guys, and it would mean the world for you to subscribe and give the video a like if you enjoy it. Don't do it now, wait till the end of the video, and if it brings you any sort of pleasure or information and any joy, just leave a subscribe, comment. All of those things mean the world to us. So without further ado, over to the interview with Stefan. Welcome, Stefan. Thanks so much for joining us today and offering a little bit of your time to help us realize and understand a little bit better about what we can and ought to not do and should do if we ever have the unfortunate fortunate happening of being arrested for cannabis in South Africa.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks again for having me. And always a pleasure to help the people where I can be prepared for what sometimes can be quite an unpleasant experience.
Definitely. Do you want to fire in and jump in?
I think let me just jump in, because let's differentiate between when you're running into trouble. Are you at your house or you're on the road? If you're at your house, you are fully within your rights to ask for that warrant. And if they do not have a warrant, without probable cause, which is a whole different conversation on its own, they can still sometimes get in, but that's a much easier point for you to then argue in court if they came in there without a warrant. Let's say you get pulled over. Sometimes they'll straight up ask you if you got something in the car, and people will ask me, should I tell them? Since we've got the constitutional courts and they feel they are allowed to travel with it, just like I advise my clients they are allowed to. But I would still say no, you are fully within your right to keep your privacy. So, sometimes just by you telling them you've got cannabis on you, that is the exact reason that would lead to a search and seizure, and that would lead to your arrest. Instead of sometimes just keeping it to yourself. I know it's a tough one to sometimes face, but that's the stigma, and that's still around cannabis and the attitude towards the police.
They have their tricks too,
Yeah, you have your right to remain silent, and if you ever do get forced into that arrest, I would exercise that right to as much of an extent as possible. Because let's say now you do get arrested, whether this be at your home or on the road, next thing you know, you're on your way in the back of the van to the local SAPS for processing. That processing does take a while, and they're going to be bullying you, intimidating you, because they're going to be throwing it in your face that they've got the right to, detain you for 48 hours. And in that time, they are going to make use of it, because once they release you from SAPS and you're on your way to court, whether it be for a bail application, then it's out of their control. And what would a lot of the times happen is, once you get released on bail, whether it be that same night or the following day, or even after the weekend, you never even get called back to courts, and you are frustrated because you have this entirely unpleasant experience. Your plants was confiscated, your super expensive grow lights was confiscated. You somehow don't even know if you're ever going to get that back, because regardless of all that threatening and intimidation that you received from SAP, suddenly you don't even get called back to court. So I think it's very important to determine and know that 48-hour window of yours is literally the only window in which they have power. So try and never give a statement. If you're arrested properly, they should read you your rights, which in terms of Section 35, of our Constitution, they'll say you've got the right to remain silent. You've got the right to an attorney. You've got the right to make your statement in court. That is always the one I would rather elect to do. Let's also discuss, what you should be prepared for. If you are arrested for less than 100 or 200 grams, there's a very good chance on a small quantity that you could get what we call police bail. So wouldn't necessarily waste your money on getting an expensive attorney down there. So get a family or a friend to come bail you out. It's 500 to 1,500 rand, but this is only for possession, and I think it's up to 300 grams. I'm talking under correction. But now, if you're talking about dealing, then you wouldn't necessarily qualify for police bail. This is in instances where you've got a few kilograms on you, either that or just via the way it's packaged. You could have 100 gram or 200 gram on you, which is still the low limit, but clearly from the packaging, you had the intention to sell, and therefore they're prosecuting you for dealing. That is a bit more of a serious offense. Therefore, you could not necessarily qualify for police bail. You would always want to talk to the detective. They've got some discretion. Otherwise, you'd have to get the prosecutors on standby. And that, let me tell you, is not an interesting thing to do. But okay, worst case scenario, you're sleeping over there the next day. Now you've got a bail application. My phone rings off the charts with people getting arrested, wanting me to drive all the way. And, it's, for me personally, to be fully transparent, not going to be worth it for you. There's plenty of attorneys that can do bail applications. I'm not going to get there and manage to throw in a whole trial on your first appearance. There's a procedure that needs to be followed. So I would say recommend get your local attorney to at least just do the bail application for you. And if necessary, that one or two appearances afterwards until the police have finalized their investigations and you're able to obtain a copy of the docket. Once you've got a copy of your docket, sure, contact a specialist in our field and we would happily discuss in taking the matter further. But it's hardly worth it or those people's time for me to drive out and do all the petty bail applications. And there's loads of attorneys going to do the same thing. So definitely something to consider. Now, let's also say once you've done your first court appearance, you've had your attorney there, it does a lot of the times happen that there's a non-prosecute or the case is temporarily withdrawn, or head say forth, you just never get a return date. The police eventually just continue with their investigations, and after the second or third time, if you've got a decent attorney, you should argue your right to a speedy trial. And then the matter would get struck off the roll until the police can finalize the investigations, which a lot of the times never seem to happen. Now there's the catch-22. You feel you were wrongly treated because if you were arrested rightfully, then at least they would have tried to prosecute you. So now, you want to maybe take on the police to get your plants or your equipment back. Because you feel they don't have a case against you just because the police didn't finalize their investigations. Let's be very clear that if you give the police an option whether they be faced with litigation to reopen that case, which they are totally entitled to do, then they would always rather reopen a case and try and prosecute you through a trial than explain why evidence have gone missing through their systems. That is a lot of the times what happens. If you get confiscated or, some of these busts have even happened where they only take the indoor and the hydro cannabis products. They don't even touch the greenhouse or the outdoor. And, Nola prosecute and what can a man do? We know those products where they've gone. But we also know that it's going to be a fight if we push it to litigation.
And most people don't want to push it because they kind of feel like they're getting off scot-free. So you're kind of saying, well, if I walk away, maybe I'll turn a blind eye just to be grateful that they've not proceeded to wrongfully accuse me, like those kind of things.
Between the bark and the tree, if you're faced with that decision. So that I'd say that would be independently up to you. And how you got treated. A lot of people have came out and said, that wasn't as bad. They weren't actually treated anywhere fairly or inhumanely. And other people I do know have a lot more unpleasant experiences. So I'd say that we'd have to determine by a case-by-case scenario to see if it's, sometimes I've had clients that really want to take on the police where I could say, sure, based on the evidence against you, I wouldn't recommend it. But other times, luckily, through great CCTV footage, etc., you've got pretty much of a good case that you are willing to take that chance and risk it by going the mile and facing them in an open court.
Brilliant. Yeah, because I can imagine they've got some pretty hefty lawyers as well.
Yeah, and they're ruthless, and they've been, they're Old Testament, so they've been trained for decades in the fight against drugs. And just because the court has now given us the right and privacy to use this substance, the stigma is still around that cannabis is a drug. And why I would say exercise that right to remain silent. And I'd much rather lie to a policeman and say, listen, it was my right to, it was never, and there's the Poppy Act, Section of Personal Information, I can tell you I'm 32, meantime I'm only turning 30. Is that a crime? Not necessarily, depending on if I do it on an open platform, and there's a whole bunch of circumstances around it. But, for a policeman, I would still say, you have to comply with their orders. If you say no and they say get out of the car and they want to do a search, fully comply. And if they say, what is this? Then you say it is your medicine. You asked if I had drugs in the car. I don't have drugs in the car. I've got my medicine.
Yeah.
That's a whole different technicality. But saying, hey, do you, Mr. Policeman, personally consider cannabis a drug? And depending on your answer, I'm going to have to say yes or no whether I do have something in the car. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And we all know that police already have too much power with these gray areas currently in place. So I wouldn't give them even the option of exercising any more power than they're already allowed to in terms of statutory laws.
I think there's a couple of things that you guys can maybe also do in terms of prevention. Keeping cannabis is legal and it's in a private capacity. So I'd assume probably not driving and smoking is, it's not something we ever really condone. And it's like, I think the police would probably be a lot more inclined to, if they look you in the eyes and you're red-eyed Jedi and you're driving down the highway, they're probably gonna.
If you are red-eyed Jedi looking them in the eye, you are still not necessarily gonna be charged for driving while being impaired. You might get a surge based on that. Them actually seeing you throwing the J out the window, pulling you out, driving back and fetching the evidence, that's a different story for actually might being, because remember, if they pull you over, they actually have to prove that you are impaired. It's not enough to prove that you are under the influence of cannabis. They actually have to show that you are impaired, which our current blood tests can't necessarily do. And why in Canada, they now implemented a new breathalyzer, which can actually detect the THC levels, in your saliva to actually test how impaired you are. When last did you smoke? How much cannabis? Because that is remaining around there. But again, what if you had edibles? You would be flying a spaceship over there, but their breathalyzer could never even detect it. So there's a whole bunch of things to consider. But I would say if you do drive around with your cannabis, try and stick to the proposed bill. I know it's not read into law yet, but it is at least the form of proposed legislation from government side, which is 115, and conceal it properly, neatly. not
That's the thing.
packaged
Yeah,
for the intention
don't show
to
it around or
distribute in 5 gram bankies. Yeah.
yeah.
If you have 3 strains and you have to put them in 3 different containers, etc., that's totally acceptable. And luckily, most of the times you can clearly see it's 3 different plants,
Mm.
so it's easily explainable. But to have a bunch of plants all looking the same in 5 gram bankies, not
It's gonna draw.
labeled or all labeled with the same strain, even sometimes it's a hard sell.
Yeah, it's unfair that we have to remain a low profile sometimes, but there is also a way off with, testing these things. And, let's say worst case, you don't get charged or you don't get prosecuted. You still maybe have to spend 2 nights in a cell somewhere. It's like there is a way off to doing these to these situations. So yeah, keep a low profile. That's always advised. Be discreet and be polite with the policeman and this and that. So there's a couple tips that I could offer from personal experience. And then I wanted to also in that time between, like, this is where I think the scary part is, that time between the police saying, okay, come with me, and the time of like leaving the police station, you're kind of already feeling like you're a criminal, like they're going to make you feel like a criminal.
They
And
really do. And that's why
yeah.
they always try and make you sign the admission of guilt. And a lot of people then come out and say, some policemen even tell you you're not going to get a record for it anymore.
Yeah.
And that is a complete lie. You come out there with a record because they actually got you to sign an admission. And that's why I always say, during that window, the police are going to exercise that abundant given power to them as much as they can. Because the moment you walk out of there, so does their power with it. Now the courts is all the power, and the court's actually the one you should be afraid of. We all run and we are scared of the police because we know it is actually the more unpleasant experience. While in reality, it should be the other way around. Getting arrested should be the pleasant experience. What should be unpleasant is the trial that you have upcoming, having to explain yourself in front of a judge, and then actually receiving judgment, which could lead to incarceration. I mean, that is actually terrifying. It is an unfortunate situation that our justice system is so, where in terms of the High Court, we've got a High Court order and a National Prosecuting Authority, all being aware of case law and the power that it has, and therefore not necessarily prosecuting all these abundant of arrests that's happening, while the police are the side just now abusing this power, because if they're not bribing grow clubs and intimidating, even private growers in their own homes.
I'm sure you've seen everything under the sun.
I've seen more than I thought I would in the couple of years that I've been practicing, and I don't wish it upon anyone.
And then lastly, correct me if I'm wrong, if that admission of guilt, I mean, that's such a big one. Because if I'm not mistaken, they'll tell you to sign that admission of guilt, and you can basically go home if you sign that admission of guilt.
You can pay 150, 500 rand. They're gonna say you walk out of here, you pay 1,500 rand, for example, and it's done. You get to go home. Here's your license that we took from you. That's it. And that way, they're gonna try and bully you into that, because that's gonna look great on their arrest.
And it's really
They've
not
got a guilty. It's as good as a guilty conviction, right?
And
confession.
I promise you, it is easy to do it, because I was in that spot at the teller, cash in hand, ready to pay the admission of guilt fine. And luckily, in my situation, the police lady said, why are you paying this fine? You should rather just go speak to the judge and see what you could do about it. She explained basically.
If you do it, then you come back to me, and it costs you 30 to 50,000 rand for a High Court application just to review that entire process of how the police intimidated you, and that's not even a guarantee. So you have to be very careful, and that's why I know it's a very intimidating and unpleasant experience there, but you also just have to, I would almost want to say, keep quiet and just wait for them to let you go. You don't say anything. They do
Don't
not
sign
have power,
anything.
even though they act like it. You don't make a statement. You make your statement in courts. You want to be in and out of there like a zombie, to be perfectly candid.
And I think there's one thing you can sign for is your possessions. If they take your phone, wallet, keys, shoes, shoelaces, waist belt, make sure to sign, like keep a good what's it, list of, you make sure the list that they write
I
down
was
is
about to
exactly
say,
it.
don't sign it if it's not exactly right. Though.
Yeah, because that's when, I mean, would
And if
they,
something's missing, you make a note there with your signature.
yeah, would your grow lights, if they bring you in with your grow lights, is that all going to be on that list, or is this going to be a separate
It's supposed to be. The problem is they're not necessarily gonna put on lux lighting, LED, how many watts, full spectrum, etc. They're gonna
light
put,
bulb.
yeah. The descriptions are gonna be very basic.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so make sure that's as detailed as possible, because that's pretty much your only proof of handing over custody to them of your belongings, which is
and it is
yours.
Unfortunately a common occurrence where things that got confiscated isn't always on the list of things that
I can only imagine. Thank you, Stefan, so much. I know, just for those that I mean, I have explained a little bit, but for those that have listened this far, I mean, Stefan is a professional in the cannabis space. It's not just arrests, it's also licensing applications, pretty much everything under the sun with regards to cannabis and the legal side of things. So yeah, if you guys are interested, SJF Attorneys, we know them well. You can always check out the links below. And yeah, Stefan, it's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.